The Island of the Day Before. Umberto Eco. Table of Contents. Title page. Table of Copyright. Table. Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Chapter 16. Chapter 17. Chapter 8. Translated from the Italian. By William Weaver. A Harvest Book. Harcourt, Inc. Orlando, Austin, New York, San Diego, Toronto, London. Copyright 1994 RCS Libri and Grandi Opere Spa Milano. English translation copyright 1995 by Harcourt, Inc. Is the Pacific Sea my home? John Donne. Hymn to God my God. Stolto, a cui parlo? Macero. Che tento? Racconto il dolor mio. All'insensata riva. Alla matola selce, al sordo vento. Ahi, ch'altro non risponde. Che il mormorar dell'onde. Giovan Battista. Marino. Eco, La Lira, She. Table of Contents. Chapter 1. Daphne. Greater than. Chapter 2. An account of events in the Monferrato. Greater than. Chapter 3. The Seraglio of Wonders. Greater than. Chapter 4. Fortification. Chapter 1. Daphne. I take pride withal in my humiliation, and as I am to this privilege condemned, almost I find joy in an abhorrent salvation. I am, I believe, alone of all our race, the only man in human memory to have been shipwrecked and cast up upon a deserted ship. Thus, with unabashed conceits, wrote Roberto della Griva presumably in July or August of 1643. How many days had he been tossed by the waves, feverish surely, bound to a plank, prone during the hours of light to avoid the blinding sun, his neck stiff, strained unnaturally so as not to imbibe the water, his lips burnt by the brine? His letters offer no answer to this question. Though they suggest an eternity, the time cannot have been more than 2 days, for otherwise he would never have survived the lash of Phoebus, of which he so poetically complains. He, a sickly youth, as he describes himself, a creature condemned by a natural defect to live only at night. He was unable to keep track of time, but I believe the sea grew calm immediately after the tempest swept him from the deck of the Amaryllis, on that makeshift raft a sailor had me fashioned for him. Driven by the trades over a serene sea, in a season when, south of the equator, a temperate winter reigns, he was carried for not many miles, until the currents at last brought him into the bay. It was night, he had dozed off, unaware that he was approaching a ship until, with a jolt, his plank struck against the prow of the Daphne. And when, in the glow of the full moon, he realized he was floating beneath a bowsprit with a rope ladder hanging from it not far from the anchor chain, a Jacob's ladder, Father Casper would have called it, in an instant all his spirit returned. His desperation must have inspired him. He tried to reckon whether he had enough breath to cry out, but his throat was all an arid fire, or enough strength to free himself from the bonds that had cut livid furrows into his skin, and then to essay the climb. I believe that at such moments a dying man can become a very Hercules and strangle serpents in his cradle. In recording the event, Roberto seems confused, but we must accept the idea that if, finally, he reached the forecastle, he must somehow have grasped that ladder. Perhaps he climbed up a bit at a time, exhausted at every gain, until he flung himself over the bulwarks, crawled along the cordage, found the forecastle door open. And instinct no doubt led him, in the darkness, to touch that barrel, pull himself up its side, until he found a cup attached to a little chain. And he drank as much as he could, then collapsed, sated, perhaps in the fullest meaning of the word, for that water probably contained enough drowned insects to supply him with food as well as drink. He must have slept 24 hours. This is only an approximate calculation. It was night when he woke, but he was as if reborn. So it was night again, not night still. He thought it was night still, for if not, a whole day had to have passed, and someone should have found him by now. The moonlight, coming from the deck, illuminated that place, apparently a kind of cookroom, where a pot was hanging above the fireplace. The room had 2 doors, one towards the bowsprit, the other opening onto the deck. And he looked out at the ladder, seeing, as if by daylight, the rigging in good order, the capstan, the masts with the sails furled, a few cannon at the gunports, and the outline of the quarterdeck. He made some sounds, but not a living soul replied. He gazed over the bulwarks, and to his right he could discern, about a mile away, the form of the island, the palm trees along its shore stirred by a breeze. The land made a kind of bend, edged with sand that gleamed white in the pale darkness. But, like any shipwrecked man, Roberto could not tell if it was an island or a continent. He staggered to the other side of the ship and glimpsed, but distant this time, almost on the line of the horizon, the peaks of another mass, defined also by 2 promontories. Everything else was sea, giving the impression that the ship was berthed in an anchorage it had entered through a channel separating the 2 stretches of land. Roberto decided that if these were not 2 islands, one was surely an island facing a vaster body of land. I do not believe he entertained other hypotheses, since he had never known bays so broad that a person in their midst could feel he was confronting twin lands. Thus, in his ignorance of boundless continents, Roberto had chanced upon the correct answer. A nice situation for a castaway, his feet solidly planted in dry land within reach. But Roberto was unable to swim. Soon he would discover there was no longboat on board, and the current meanwhile had carried away the plank on which he had arrived. Hence his relief at having escaped death was now accompanied by dismay at this treble solitude, of the sea, the neighboring island, and the ship. Ahoy! He must have tried to shout on the ship, in every language he knew, discovering how weak he truly was. Silence, as if on board everyone was dead, and never had he, so generous with similes, expressed himself more literally. Or almost, and this is what I would fain tell you about, if only I knew where to begin. For that matter, I have already begun. A man drifts, exhausted, over the ocean, and the complacent waters bring him to a ship, apparently deserted. Deserted as if the crew has just abandoned it, for Roberto struggles back to the cookroom and finds a lamp there and a flint and steel, as if the cook set them in their place before going to bed. But the two berths beside the furnace, one above the other, are both empty. Roberto lights the lamp, looks around, and finds a great quantity of food, dried fish, hardtack, with only a few patches of mold easily scraped away with a knife. The fish is very salty, but there is water in abundance. He must have regained his strength quickly, or else he was strong when he was writing this, for he goes into highly literary detail about his banquet. Never did Olympus see such a feast as his. Jove's nectar, to me sweet ambrosia from farthest Pontus. But these are the things Roberto writes to the lady of his heart. Son of my shadows, light of my darkness. Why did heaven not unmake me in that tempest it had so savagely provoked? Why save from the all-devouring sea this body of mine, only to wreck my soul so horribly in such mean and even more ill-starred solitude? Perhaps, if merciful heaven does not send me succor, you will never read this letter I now indite, and, consumed like a torch by the light of these seas, I will become dark to your eyes, as to some Selene, who, rejoicing too much in the light of her sun, gradually consumes her journey beyond the far curve of our planet, bereft of the beneficent rays of her sovereign star. First growing thin to recall the sickle that severs the thread of life, then ever paler, she is completely dissolved in that vast cerulean shield where ingenious nature forms heroic heraldry, mysterious emblems of her secrets. Bereft of your gaze, I am blind for you see me not, dumb for you address me not, oblivious for you forget me. And, alone, I live, bunding dullness and tenebrous flame, vague spectre that in this adverse conflict of opposites my mind imagines ever the same, and so would convey to yours. Saving my life in this wood fortress, in this rocking bastion that defends me, prisoner of the sea, from the sea, punished by the clemency of heaven, hidden in this deep sarcophagus open to every sun, in this airy dungeon, in this impregnable prison that offers me everywhere escape, I despair of seeing you more. My lady, I write you as if to offer, unworthy tribute, the withered rose of my disheartenment. And yet I take pride withal in my humiliation, and as I am to this privilege condemned, almost I find joy in an abhorrent salvation. I am, I believe, alone of all our race, the only man in human memory to have been shipwrecked and cast upon a deserted ship. But is this really possible? To judge by the date of his first letter, Roberto begins writing immediately after his arrival, as soon as he finds pen and paper in the captain's quarters, before exploring the rest of the ship. And yet he must have required some time to recover his strength, reduced as he was to the condition of a wounded animal. Or perhaps, with a little amorous ruse, after first trying to ascertain his whereabouts, he then writes, pretending to write her before giving any thought to other things. But why, and as much as he knows, assumes, fears that these letters will never arrive and that he is writing them only for his own tormenting solace, he would say, but we must not fall into his literary habits. It is difficult to reconstruct the actions and feelings of a character surely afire with true love, for you never know whether he is expressing what he feels or what the rules of amorous discourse prescribe in his case. But then, for that matter, what do we know of the difference between passion felt and passion expressed, and who can say which has precedence? So Roberto was writing for himself. This was not literature, he was there truly, writing like an adolescent pursuing an impossible mirage, streaking the page with his tears, not because of the absence of the lady, pure image even when she was present, but out of fondness of himself, enamored of love. The situation is the stuff of a novel, but, once more, where to begin? I say he wrote this first missive later, and before writing it, he had a look around, and in subsequent letters he will relate what he saw. But those, too, raise the question of how to treat the diary of a man with poor vision, who roams during the night, relying on his weak eyes. Roberto will tell us that his eyes had been affected since the days of the siege of Kausali, when that bullet grazed his temple. And this may be true, but elsewhere he hints that the weakness was caused by the plague. Roberto was certainly frail, and I infer he was also a hypochondriac, though in moderation. Half of his photophobia must have been due to black bile, and half to some form of irritation, perhaps exacerbated by Monsieur Digby's salves. It seems certain that during the voyage of the Amaryllis he remained below deck, since the role of photophobe, if it was not his true nature, was the part he had to play to keep an eye on what happened in the hold. Several months in total darkness or in dim lamplight, and then the time on the plank, dazzled by the equatorial or tropical sun, whichever it was. When he lands then on the Daphne, sick or not, he hates the sun, spends the first night in the cookroom, recovers his strength and attempts a first inspection the night following, and then things proceed virtually of themselves. Day frightens him. Not only will his eyes not tolerate it, but neither will the burns he must surely have on his back. So he goes to ground. The beautiful moon he describes on those nights reassures him. During the day the sky is the same as everywhere else. At night he discovers new constellations, heroic heraldry and mysterious emblems. In fact, it is like being in a theater. He is convinced that this will be his life for a long time, perhaps until his death. He refashions his lady on paper so as not to lose her, and he knows he has not lost much more than the little he had before. At this point he takes refuge in his nightly vigils as in a maternal womb, and becomes thus more determined to elude the sun. Perhaps he has read of those resurgents of Hungary, of Livonia or Wallachia, who wander restless between sunset and dawn, hiding then in their graves at cockcrow. The role could lure him. Roberto must have begun his survey on the second night. By then he had shouted enough to be sure that there was no one else on board. But, and this he feared, he might find corpses or some sign that explained their absence. He moved cautiously, and from his letters it is hard to tell in which direction. He names the ship's parts, the objects inexactly. Some are familiar to him and he has heard them from the sailors. Others are unknown, and he describes them as they appear to him. But even of the familiar objects, an indication that on the Amaryllis the crew probably represented the dregs of the seven seas. He must have heard one in French, another in Dutch, and another in English. Thus he says staff, as Dr. Bird must have taught him, for the Jacob's staff. At times it is hard to understand how he could be one moment on the poop deck or the quarterdeck, and another on the galliard derriere, which is the Frenchified way of saying the same thing. For gunport he uses sabordo, and I allow him the word gladly because it recalls the seafaring books most of us read as children. He talks about the parochetto, which for us is a foretopsail, but since the French barouche is the topgallant, there is no. Thus he says staff, as Dr. Bird must have taught him, for the Jacob's staff. At times it is hard to understand how he could be one moment on the poop deck or the quarterdeck, and another on the galliard derriere, which is the Frenchified way of saying the same thing. For gunport he uses sabordo, and I allow him the word gladly because it recalls the seafaring books most of us read as children. He talks about the parochetto, which for us is a foretopsail, but since the French barouche is the topgallant, there is no telling what he is referring to when he says he was under the paruchetta. Have taught him, for the Jacob's staff. At times it is hard to understand how he could be one moment on the poop deck or the quarterdeck, and another on the galliard derriere, which is the Frenchified way of saying the same thing. For gunport he uses sabordo, and I allow him the word gladly because it recalls the seafaring books most of us read as children. He talks about the parochetto, which for us is a foretopsail, but since the French barouche is the topgallant, there is no telling what he is referring to when he says he was under the paruchetta. Furthermore, sometimes he calls the mizzen the ardaman, in the French way, but what can he mean then when he writes mizzen, which is how the French identify the foremast, but, alas, not the English, for whom the mizana is the mizzen, God help us. And when he says eaves, he is probably referring to what we would call scuppers. So I have come to a decision here. I will try to decipher his intentions, then use the terms most familiar to us. If I am mistaken, too bad, the story remains the same. This said, we will assume that on the second night, after finding a store of food in the cookroom, Roberto somehow proceeded in the moonlight to cross the deck. Recalling the foredeck and the curved sides vaguely glimpsed the night before, judging now by the slim deck, the shape of the castle and the narrow, convex poop, and comparing all this with the Amaryllis, Roberto concluded that the Daphne was a Dutch flute, or flust, or flyboat, or fleeboat, as they are variously called, those trading vessels of medium displacement, usually armed with about 10 cannons to ease the conscience in the event of a pirate attack. Given its dimensions, it could be handled by a dozen seamen, and could carry many more passengers if it renounced comforts, scarce to begin with, cramming the space with pallets until the men tripped over them. Gradually, their number would be reduced by epidemic deaths from miasmas of every kind if there were not enough sanitary provisions. So a flute it was, then, but larger than the Amaryllis, yet with a deck reduced, almost, to a single hatchway, as if the captain had been anxious to ship water at every over lively wave. In any case, it was a good thing the Daphne was a flute. Roberto could move about with some knowledge of how the space was divided. For example, in the center of the deck there should have been a longboat big enough to contain the entire crew. The fact that it was not there suggested the crew was elsewhere. But this did not reassure Roberto. An entire crew never leaves the ship unmanned, at the mercy of the sea, even if that ship is at anchor, its sails struck, in a calm bay. That evening he promptly headed for the aft quarters and opened the door of the castle shyly, as if he should have asked somebody's permission. Set next to the tiller, the compass told him that the channel between the two stretches of land ran from south to north. Then he found himself in what today would be called the wardroom, an L-shaped cabin, from which another door admitted him to the captain's quarters, with its large porthole over the rudder and lateral accesses to the gallery. On the Amaryllis the wardroom was not connected to the cabin where the captain slept, but here it looked as if they had tried to save space in order to make room for something else. And, in fact, while to the left of the wardroom there were two little cubbyholes for junior officers, on the right another cabin had been created, almost wider than the captain's, with a plain bunk at the end, but otherwise arranged as a workspace. The table was cluttered with maps, more numerous, it seemed to Roberto, than those a ship normally requires for navigation. This room seemed a scholar's study. Among the papers he saw some spyglasses lying, a handsome copper noctiluabe that cast tawny glints as if it were itself a source of light, an armillary sphere fastened to the surface of the table, more papers covered with calculations, and a parchment with circular drawings in red and black, which he recognized, having seen various copies of the same on the Amaryllis, though of cruder facture, as a reproduction of the ephemerides of Regiomontanus. He went back into the wardroom. Stepping out into the gallery, he could see the island, he could stare, Roberto wrote, with lynx eyes at its silence. In other words, the island was there, as it had been before. He must have arrived at the ship nearly naked. I believe that, first of all, besmirched as he was by the sea's brine, he washed in the cookroom, not pausing to wonder if that water was all there was on board. Then, in a chest, he found a handsome suit of clothing of the captain's, the outfit reserved for the final coming ashore. Roberto may even have swaggered a bit in his commander's garb, and pulling on the boots must have made him feel in his element once again. Only at this point can a decent man, suitably clad, and not an emaciated castaway, officially take possession of an abandoned ship. With no sense of committing a violation, but rather as if exercising a right, Roberto examined the tabletop until he found, lying open, apparently left interrupted, beside the goose quill pen and the inkwell, the ship's log. The first page told him the name of the ship, but for the rest it was an incomprehensible sequence of anchor, passer, stair keeker, roar, and it was of little help for him to learn that the captain was Flemish. Still, the last line bore a date, now a few weeks past, and after a few meaningless words an expression in proper Latin stood out, underlined, pestis quae dissiter bubonica. It was a clue, a hint of explanation. An epidemic had broken out on board. This news did not trouble Roberto. He had had his bout of plague 13 years earlier, and as all know, whoever has had the sickness gains a kind of grace, as if that serpent does not dare introduce itself a second time into the loins of one who has previously tamed it. For the rest, the hint did not explain much, and prompted other worries. So they were all dead. But in that case he should have found, scattered in disorder on the deck, the corpses of the last, since the first to die must have been given Christian burial at sea. There was the absence of the longboat. The last men, or all of them, had left the ship. What makes a ship of plague victims a place of invincible menace? Rats, perhaps? Roberto seemed to decipher, in the captain's Ostrogothic writing, the word rottennest, which he took to mean rat's nest, and he immediately turned, raising the lamp as he glimpsed something slithering along the wall and heard the squeaking that on the Amaryllis had made his blood run cold. With a shudder he recalled an evening when a hairy creature had grazed his face as he was falling asleep, and his cry of terror had brought Dr. Bird running. The others then taunted him. Even without the plague, there are as many rats on a ship as there are birds in a forest, and you must become accustomed to them if you want to sail the seas. But in the after castle, at least, there was not a whiff of rats. Perhaps they had collected in the bilge, their red eyes glowing in the darkness, waiting for fresh meat. Roberto told himself that if they were on board, he had to know it at once. If they were ordinary rats, in an ordinary number, he could live with them. And what else could they be, anyway? He asked himself this question, and preferred not to answer it. He found a musket, a sword, and a knife. He had been a soldier. He picked up the musket, a caliver, as the English called them, which could be aimed without a rest. He examined it, more for reassurance than with any notion of wiping out a pack of rats by shooting them, and he also slipped the knife into his belt, though knives are of scant use against rats. He had decided to explore the hull from prow to poop. Back in the cookroom, by a little ladder set against the bowsprit he descended into the larder, or pantry, I believe, where provisions for a long voyage had been stored. The crew, since they could not store enough for the duration of the journey, had only recently replenished supplies at some friendly shore. There were baskets of fish, just smoked, and pyramids of coconuts, and barrels of tubers of an unfamiliar shape but apparently edible. And there were fruits such as Roberto had seen on the Amaryllis after its first tropical ports of call, fruits that resisted the seasons, prickly and scaly but with a pungent aroma that promised well-defended pulp, sweet hidden humors. And some island crop must have produced those sacks of gray flour that smelled of tufa and also of the loaves whose taste recalled the insipid warty shapes that the Indians of the New World call potatoes. In the corner he saw also about a dozen little kegs with bung holes. He tapped the first, and tasted water not yet putrid, indeed, only recently collected and treated with sulfur to make it last longer. There was not a great deal, but considering that the fruit, too, would slake his thirst, he could survive on the ship for a long time. And yet these discoveries, which should have made him realize he would not die of starvation on board, made him all the more uneasy, as is the way of melancholic spirits, to whom every sign of good fortune forebodes dire consequences. To be shipwrecked on a deserted ship was in itself an unnatural circumstance, but if the ship had at least been abandoned by men and by God as a worthless relic, with no objects of nature or of art to make it an attractive refuge, this would have been in the order of things, and of the chronicles of seamen. But to find it like this, arranged as if to welcome an expected guest like a subtle offering, smacked of sulfur even more than did the water. Roberto was reminded of fairy tales his grandmother used to tell him, and other tales in finer prose read in the Paris salons, where princesses lost in the forest entered a castle and found sumptuously furnished chambers with canopied beds and cupboards filled with luxurious dresses and even tables laid. And, of course, the last room would contain the sulphurous revelation of the malignant mind that had set the trap. He touched a coconut at the base of the pile, disturbing the balance of the whole, and those bristled forms came down in an avalanche, like rats waiting, mute, on the ground, or like bats that hang upside down from the beams of an attic, ready now to climb up his body and sniff his face salty with sweat. Roberto had to make sure that this was not a spell. He had learned in his travels how to deal with foreign fruits. Using his knife as a hatchet, he cracked the nut open with one blow, gnawing at the manna concealed beneath the husk. It was all so sweetly good that the sensation of a snare grew stronger. Perhaps, he told himself, he was already a victim of illusion. He tasted coconuts but in reality was biting into rodents. He was already absorbing their quiddity. Soon his hands would grow thinner, taloned, hooked. His body would be covered with a sour fuzz. His back would bend in an arc, and he would be received in the sinister apotheosis of the shaggy inhabitants of this vessel of Acheron. But, to conclude this account of the first night, another signal of horror was to surprise our explorer. As if the collapse of the coconuts had wakened sleeping creatures, he heard coming nearer, beyond the partition that separated the larder from the rest of the lower deck, not a squeaking but a cheeping, a chirping, and the scratching of paws. So this was truly a trap. Night animals were holding their council in some lair. Roberto wondered if, musket in hand, he should confront immediately that Armageddon. His heart beat irregularly. He called himself a coward, knowing that, whether it was this night or another, sooner or later he would have to face them. He hovered, climbed up on deck again, and fortunately glimpsed the dawn already casting a waxy light on the metal of the cannons, until then caressed by the moon's beams. Day was breaking, he told himself with relief, and he was duty-bound to flee it. Like a resurgent of Hungary, he ran along the deck to regain the after castle. He entered the cabin that was now his, barred the door, closed the accesses to the gallery, placed his weapons within reach, and prepared to sleep so as not to see the sun, that executioner who with the axe of his rays severs the necks of shadows. Restless, he dreamed of his shipwreck, and dreamed it as a man of wit, who even in dreams, or especially in them, must take care that his propositions embellish a conception, so reservations make it vital, while mysterious connections give it density. Considerations make it profound. Emphases uplift, allusions dissimulate, transmutations make subtle. I imagine that in those days, and on those seas, more ships were wrecked than returned safely home, but to one shipwrecked for the first time the experience must have been a source of recurrent nightmares, which the habit of expressing inappropriate conceits must have made as picturesque as a last judgment. Since the evening before, it was as if the air had sickened with catarrh, and it seemed that the eye of heaven, brimming with tears, could support no longer the sight of the expanse of waves. The brush of nature had now diluted the line of the horizon and was sketching distances of indefinite provinces. Roberto, whose viscera have already predicted an imminent catastrophe, flings himself on his pallet, rocked now by a nurse of giants, dozes amid uneasy dreams of which he dreams the dream he relates, and beholds before his very eyes a host of galactic wonders. He wakes to the bacchanal of thunder and the cries of the sailors, then streams of water invade his berth. Dr. Bird looks in and, running, cries to him to come up on deck and cling firmly to anything more firm than himself. On deck, confusion, groans, and bodies, as if lifted, all, by a divine hand and flung into the sea. For a moment Roberto grasps the spanker boom, if I have understood correctly, until the sail is rent, shredded by thunderbolts. The boom and the gaff both start emulating the curved course of the stars, and Roberto is flung at the foot of the mizzenmast. There a good-hearted sailor, unable to make room for him, throws him a rope and tells him to tie himself to a door torn from its hinges and hurled here from the castle, and luckily for Roberto the door, with him as its parasite, then slides to the bulwarks, for in the meanwhile the mast snaps in two, and a yard crashes down and splits open the head of his erstwhile Samaritan. From a breach in the flank Roberto sees, or dreams he is seeing, cyclades of accumulated shadows as thunderbolts dart and roam over the fields of waves. And to me this seems excessive indulgence of a taste for precious quotation. But in any event, the Amaryllis tilts in the direction of the castaway ready to be cast away, and Roberto on his plank slides into an abyss above which he glimpses, as he sinks, the ocean freely rising to imitate cliffs. In the delirium of his eyelids he sees fallen pyramids rise. He finds himself an aquatic comet fleeing along the orbit of that turmoil of liquid skies. As every wave flashes with lucid inconstancy, here foam bends, there a vortex gurgles and a fount opens. Bundles of crazed meteors offer the counter subject to the seditious aria shattered by thundering. The sky is an alternation of remote lights and downpours of darkness, and Roberto writes that he saw foaming Alps within wanton troughs whose spume was transformed into harvests. And Ceres blossomed amid sapphire glints, and at intervals in a cascade of roaring opals, as if her telluric daughter Persephone had taken command, exiling her plenteous mother. And, among errant, bellowing beasts, as the silvery salts boil in stormy tumult, Roberto suddenly ceases to admire the spectacle, and becomes its insensate participant. He lies stunned and knows no more of what happens to him. It is only later that he will assume, in dreams, that the plank, by some merciful decree of heaven or through the instinct of an adamant object, joins in that jaggi and, as it descended, naturally rises, calmed in a slow saraband. Then in the color of the elements the rules of every urbane order of dance are subverted. and with ever more elaborate periphrases it moves away from the heart of the joust, where a Versipellis top spun in the hands of the sons of Aeolus, the hapless Amaryllis sinks, bowsprit aimed at the sky. And, with it, sinks every other living soul in its hold, the Jew destined to find in the heavenly Jerusalem the terrestrial Jerusalem he would reach no longer. The Knight of Malta parted forever from the island Escondida, Dr. Bird from his acolytes and, finally rescued by merciful nature from the comforts of the physician's art, from that poor, infinitely ulcerated dog that, as it happens, I have not yet been able to mention because Roberto does not write of him until later. But, in fine, I presume that dream and tempest made Roberto's sleep so uneasy that it was limited to a very brief time, to be followed by a bellicose wakefulness. In fact, accepting that outside it was day, but reassured that faint light penetrated the large opaque windows of the castle, and confident that he could go below by some interior stair, he mustered his courage, collected his weapons, and with audacious fear set out to find the source of those nocturnal noises. Or, rather, he does not set out at once. I must crave indulgence, but it is Roberto who, in telling this to the lady, contradicts himself, an indication that he does not tell in complete detail what has happened to him, but instead tries to construct his letter like a story or, more, like a sketch for what could become both letter and story, and he writes without deciding what things he will select later. He drafts, so to speak, the pieces of his chessboard without immediately establishing which to move and how to deploy them. In one letter he says he went off to venture below, but in another he writes that, barely wakened at the morning light, he was struck by a distant concert. Sounds coming surely from the island. At first Roberto imagined a horde of natives cramming into long canoes to raid the ship, and he clenched his musket, but then the concert sounded to him less combative. It was dawn, and the sun did not yet strike the panes. He stepped into the gallery, caught the smell of the sea, opened the window slightly, and with his eyes half closed he tried to make out the shore. Aboard the Amaryllis, where he never went out on deck during the day, Roberto had heard the passengers tell of fiery dawns as if the sun were impatient to shoot its arrows at the world, whereas now, with no tears, he saw pastel hues. A sky foaming with dark clouds faintly edged in pearl, while a tinge, a memory, of pink was rising behind the island, which seemed colored turquoise on rough paper. But that almost Nordic palette was enough for him to understand that the outline, which at night had seemed homogeneous, was created by the lines of a wooded hill that ended in a steep slope over a stretch covered with tall trees, down to the palms that lined the white beach. Slowly the sand grew more luminous, and along the edges, at the sides, he could discern what seemed gigantic embalmed spiders as they were moving their skeletal limbs into the water. Roberto, from the distance, conceived of them as ambulant vegetables, but at that moment the glare of the sand, now too bright, made him withdraw. He discovered that where his eyes might fail, his hearing would not betray him, and he entrusted himself to that sense, closing the window almost completely and lending an ear to the noises from land. He was accustomed to the dawns of his native hill, but he realized that for the first time in his life he was hearing birds really sing, and he had never heard so many, so various. By the thousands they hailed the sunrise. It seemed to him that he could recognize, among the parrot's cries, the nightingale, the blackbird, the calendar, an infinite number of swallows, and even the shrill sound of the cicada and the cricket, and he wondered if the animals he heard were actually of those species and not some antipodal cousin of theirs. The island was distant, and yet he had the impression that those sounds carried a scent of orange blossoms and basil, as if the air of all the bay were steeped in perfume, and for that matter M. Digby had told him how, in the course of one of his voyages, he had recognized the nearness of land by a waft of odorous atoms borne by the winds. He sniffed and listened to that invisible throng, as if looking from the battlements of a castle or the slit windows of a fort at an army vociferously fanning out along the slope of the hill and the plain below, and along the river that protected the walls. He had the impression of having already experienced what he was imagining, and in the face of the immensity that besieged him, he felt besieged, and he almost aimed his musket. He was at Casale again, and before him was spread out the Spanish army, with the noise of its wagons, the clash of arms, the tenor voices of the Castilians, the shouting of the Neapolitans, the harsh grunts of the lanzknechts, and in the background some trumpet blasts that, however, reached him muted, above the muffled sounds of an occasional arquebus, clock, paff, taa boom, like the fireworks on the feast day of the local saint. As if his life had been spent between two sieges, one the image of the other, with the sole difference that now, at the conclusion of this circle of two full lustra, this river was too broad and also encircling, so any sortie was impossible. Roberto lived again the days of Casale. Chapter 2. An account of events in the Monferrato. Roberto tells us very little about the 16 years of his life preceding that summer of 1630. He refers to episodes of the past only when they seem to have some connection with his present on the Daphne, and the chronicler of his turbulent annals must read between the lines of the story. To judge by his quirks, he is the sort of author who, to postpone the unmasking of the murderer, gives the reader only the scantiest of clues. And so I must wrest hints from him, as if from a delator. The Pozzo di San Patrizio family belonged to the minor nobility, lords of the vast estate of La Griva along the border of the province of Alessandria, in those days a part of the Duchy of Milan, and hence Spanish territory, but whether for geographical reasons or because of temperament, they considered themselves vassals of the Marquis of Monferrato. Roberto's father spoke French with his wife, the local dialect with his peasants, and Italian with foreigners. To his son he expressed himself in various ways, depending on whether he was teaching the boy a secret of swordsmanship or taking him on a ride through the fields, cursing the birds that were ruining the crops. For the rest, the young Roberto spent his time without friends, daydreaming of distant lands as he wandered, bored, through the vineyards, or of falconry if he was hunting swallows, or combating dragons as he played with his dogs, or hidden treasure as he explored the rooms of their little castle or fort, as it could also be called. His mind was inspired to wander thus by the dusty volumes of romances and chivalric poems he found in the South Tower. So he was not uneducated, and he even had a tutor, if only seasonally, a Carmelite who had supposedly traveled in the Orient, where, it was murmured, the boy's mother would repeat, blessing herself, he had become a Mussulman. Once a year he would arrive at the castle with a manservant and 4 little mules laden with books and other scribblings, and he would be housed there for 3 months. What he taught his pupil I cannot say, but when Roberto turned up in Paris, he made a favorable impression. In any case he was quick to learn whatever he was told. Of this Carmelite only one thing is known, and it is no accident that Roberto mentions it. One day old Pozo cut himself while polishing a sword, and whether because the weapon was rusty, or because he had injured a sensitive part of his hand or fingers, the wound provoked severe pain. Then the Carmelite took the blade and sprinkled on it some powder that he kept in a little box. Immediately old Pozo swore he felt relief. In fact, the next day the wound was already healing. The Carmelite enjoyed the general amazement, and he told father and son how the secret of this substance had been revealed to him by an Arab. It was a medicine far more powerful than the one Christian spagyrists called unguentum armarium. When they asked him why the powder was put not on the wound but, rather, on the blade that had produced it, he answered that such is the working of nature, among whose strongest forces is a universal sympathy, which governs actions at a distance. And he added that if this seemed hard to believe, they had only to think of the magnet, which is a stone that draws metal filings to itself, or of the great iron mountains, which cover the northern part of our planet and attract the needle of the compass. And so the unguent, adhering firmly to the sword, drew out those virtues of iron that the sword had left in the wound, impeding its healing. Any man who in youth witnesses something of this sort cannot but remain marked by it for the rest of his life, and we shall soon see how Roberto's destiny was sealed by his attraction towards the attractive power of powders and unguents. This, however, is not the episode that left the greatest mark on Roberto's boyhood. There is another, though properly speaking it is not an episode, it is more like a refrain, of which the boy preserved a suspect memory. It seems that his father, who was surely fond of his son even if he treated him with the taciturn roughness characteristic of the men of those lands, sometimes, and precisely in the first 5 years of Roberto's life, would lift him from the ground and shout proudly, "You are my firstborn." Nothing strange, to be sure, beyond the venial sin of redundance, since Roberto was an only child. But, as he grew up, Roberto began to remember, or convinced himself that he remembered, how, at these outbursts of paternal joy, his mother's face would assume an expression of pleasure mingled with uneasiness, as if the father did well to say those words, though their repetition stirred in her an anxiety never completely eased. Roberto's imagination had long leapt and danced around the tone of that exclamation, concluding that his father did not utter it as if it were an assertion of the obvious but, rather, as an odd investiture, underlining the you, as if to say, you, and not another, are my firstborn son. Not another, or not that other? In Roberto's letters there appears always some reference to another, who haunts him, and the idea seems to have been born in him during those very years, when he became convinced. And what else could a little boy brood over, isolated as he was among bat-infested turrets, vineyards, lizards and horses, awkward in dealing with the big peasant boys his age, his unequal peers, a boy who when he was not listening to the fairy tales of his grandmother listened to those of the Carmelite, convinced that somewhere an unrecognized brother was at large, who must have been of an evil nature, as their father had repudiated him. Roberto was at first too little and then too modest to wonder if this brother was on his father's side or on his mother's. In either case one of his parents would have been living under the cloud of an ancient, unpardonable sin. A brother in some way, perhaps supernaturally, guilty of the rejection he had suffered, and because of it he surely hated him, Roberto, the favorite. The shadow of this enemy brother, whom he would have liked to know, all the same, in order to love him and be loved, had troubled his nights as a boy. Later, in adolescence, he leafed through old volumes in the library, hoping to find hidden there, what? A portrait, a certificate from the curate, a revelatory confession. He wandered through the garrets, opening old chests full of great-grandparents' clothes, rusted medals, a Moorish dagger. And he lingered to question, with puzzled fingers, embroidered dresses that had certainly clad an infant, but whether that was years or centuries ago, there was no knowing. Gradually he had also come to give this lost brother a name, Ferrante, and had begun attributing to him the little crimes of which he himself was wrongfully accused, like the theft of a cake or the improper liberation of a dog from his chain. Ferrante, privileged by his banishment, acted behind Roberto's back, and Roberto in turn hid behind Ferrante. Indeed, little by little the habit of blaming the non-existent brother for what he, Roberto, could not have done, became transformed into the habit of inculpating him with what Roberto had done, and of which he repented. It was not that Roberto told others a lie. Rather, with a lump in his throat, silently assuming the punishment for his own misdeeds, he managed to convince himself of his innocence and to feel the victim of an injustice. Once, for example, to try out a new axe that the smith had just delivered to him, also partly out of spite for some abuse or other that he felt he had endured, Roberto chopped down a little fruit tree that his father had only recently planted with great hopes for future seasons. When Roberto realized the gravity of his foolishness, he imagined atrocious consequences. Being sold to the Turks, at the very least, so they could set him rowing for life in their galleys. He was preparing to attempt flight, ready to end his life as an outlaw in the hills. Seeking a justification, he quickly persuaded himself that the person who had cut down the tree was Ferrante. But, discovering the crime, his father assembled all the boys of the estate and said that, to avert his indiscriminate wrath, the guilty party would be wise to confess. Roberto felt mercifully generous. If he blamed Ferrante, the poor boy would suffer another repudiation. And after all, the unhappy child misbehaved as if to confirm his orphaned abandonment, offended as he was by the sight of his parents smothering another in caresses. Roberto took a step forward and, trembling with fear and pride, declared that he wanted no one else to be blamed in his stead. This statement, though it was not a confession, was taken for one. Twisting his mustache and looking at the boy's mother, the father said, harshly clearing his throat several times, that to be sure the crime was very serious, and punishment was inevitable, but he could not help but appreciate that the young master of La Griva had honored the family tradition, and this was how a gentleman should always act, even if he was only 8 years old. Then he announced that Roberto would not be allowed to participate in the mid-August visit to his cousins at San Salvador, which was a grievous punishment. At San Salvador there was Quirino, a vintner who could hoist Roberto to the top of a dizzyingly tall fig tree, but less grievous, certainly, than the galleys of the Sultan. To us the story seems simple. The father, proud to have an offspring who does not lie, looks at the mother with ill-concealed contentment and administers a mild punishment to save face. But Roberto then embroidered this event at length, arriving at the conclusion that his father and mother had no doubt guessed the culprit was Ferrante, had appreciated the fraternal heroism of their preferred son, and had felt relieved not to have to bear the family secret. Perhaps it is I who am embroidering, from meager clues, but the presence of the absent brother will have its importance in our story. We will find traces of this puerile game in the behavior of the adult Roberto, or at least of Roberto at the moment we find him on the Daphne, in a plight that, to tell the truth, would have ensnared anyone. But I digress. We have still to establish how Roberto arrived at the siege of Casale. And here we must give fantasy free rein and imagine how it might have happened. It took time for news to reach La Griva, but for at least 2 years they had known that the succession to the dukedom of Mantua was causing the Monferrato region much trouble, and a bit of a siege had already taken place. To be brief, and this is a story that others have already told, though in a fashion even more fragmentary than mine, in December of 1627 the Duke Vincenzo II of Mantua is dying, and around the deathbed of the old rake who has been unable to produce sons there is a ballet of 4 claimants, with their agents and their protectors. The victor is the Marquis of Saint Charmant, who manages to convince Vincenzo that the inheritance should go to a cousin in the French line, Charles de Gonzaga, Duke of Nevers. Old Vincenzo, between one dying gasp and the next, forces or allows Nevers to marry in great haste his niece Maria Gonzaga, then he dies, leaving his new nephew the dukedom. Now Nevers was French, and the duchy he was inheriting comprised also the March of Monferrato with Casale, its capital, the most important fortress in northern Italy. Situated as it was, between Spanish Milan and the lands of the Savoys, Monferrato controlled the upper course of the Po, the passes between the Alps and the south, the road from Milan to Genoa, and it acted as a cushion between France and Spain. For neither of the two powers could trust that other cushion state, the Duchy of Savoy, where Charles Emmanuel I was playing a game that it would have been kind to call duplicitous. If Monferrato went to Nevers, practically speaking it would go to Richelieu, so Spain obviously preferred someone else inherit, say, the Duke of Guastalla, ignoring the fact that the Duke of Savoy also had some claim to the succession. But since a will existed, and it designated Nevers, the other pretenders could only hope that the Germanic Holy Roman Emperor, whose feudatory the Duke of Mantua formerly was, would refuse to ratify the succession. But the Spanish were impatient and, while all were waiting for the emperor to come to a decision, Casale had already been besieged once by Gonzalo de Cordoba and now, for the second time, an imposing army of Spaniards and Imperials commanded by Spinola was surrounding it. The French garrison was preparing to resist, expecting a French army to come to its aid, but that army was still engaged in the north, and only God knew if it would arrive at Casale in time. This was more or less the situation when old Pozzo, in mid-April, assembled before the castle the younger men of his household and the most keen of his peasants, and distributed the arms in his possession. Then he called Roberto and all made this speech, which he must have spent the whole night rehearsing. Now listen to me, the lot of you. This land of ours, La Griva, has always paid tribute to the Lord of Monferrato, who for quite a while has also been, practically speaking, the Duke of Mantua. Now the Duke is this Nevers, and if anybody comes and tells me that Nevers is not a Mantuan or a Monferrino, I'll kick his backside, because you're nothing but a bunch of ignoramuses, incapable of understanding these things, so best you keep your mouths shut and leave everything to your master, who at least knows what honor is. For most of you, I know, honor is not worth spitting on, but let me tell you something. If the Imperials enter Casale, they are not men with scruples. Your vineyards will go to hell, and as for your women, better not think about it. So we are off to defend Casale. I am not forcing anybody. If there is some lazy, lily-livered lout who does not agree with me, he should speak up right now, and I will have him hanged from that oak. None of those present could yet have seen the etchings of Calais with clumps of people like these hanging from other oaks, but there must have been something in the air. They all raised their weapons, Muskets or pikes or simple poles with a sickle tied to the top, and they yelled, "Viva Casali, down with the Imperials." In one voice. "My son," Pozzo said to Roberto as they were riding over the hills, their little army following them on foot, "that Nevers isn't worth one of my balls," and old Vincenzo, when he passed on the dukedom, not only had a limp prick but a limp brain as well. But he gave it to Nevers and not to that blockhead Guastalla, and the Pozzos have been vassals of the legitimate lords of Monferrato since the beginning of time. So we're going to Casali and, if we have to, we'll get ourselves killed because, god damn it, you can't stick with somebody when things go well and then drop him when he's up to his neck in the muck. But if we manage not to get ourselves killed, all the better. So keep your eyes open. The journey of those volunteers, from the border of the Alessandria country to Casali, was surely one of the longest in recorded history. Old Pozzo's reasoning was in itself exemplary. "I know Spaniards," he said, "they're people who like to take their time. They'll head for Casali by way of the plains to the south, where wagons and cannons and various contraptions can pass more easily. So if we turn west, just before Mirabello, and follow the road through the hills, we'll take a day or two longer, but we'll get there without running into trouble, and we'll still be ahead of the Spaniards." Unfortunately, Spinola had more tortuous ideas about the preparation of a siege and, when he was to the southeast of Casali, he began by ordering the occupation of Valenza and Oximiano. Several weeks previously he had sent the Duke of Lerma, Ottavio Sforza, and the Count of Gemberg to the west of the city, with about 7,000 foot soldiers, to try to take immediately the castles of Rossignano, Pentestura, and San Giorgio, thinking to block any possible support that might come from the French army, as, scissor-like, from the north, crossing the Po and heading south, the governor of Alessandria, Don Geronimo Augustin, was advancing with another 5,000 men. And all were deployed along the path that Pozzo believed to be felicitously deserted. Nor, when our gentleman learned as much from some peasant, could he change his route, for to the east, by now, there were more Imperials than to the west. Pozzo said simply, "We'll stick to our plan. I know these parts better than they do, and we'll slip past like weasels." Which meant altering the plan considerably. And they even encountered the French from Pentestura, who meanwhile had surrendered and, on condition that they did not return to Casali, had been allowed to proceed towards Finale, where they could set out for France by sea. The Griva men came upon them around Ottalia, and they were close to firing, each side believing that the other was an enemy. From their commander Pozzo learned that, among the terms of the surrender, it was established that the Pentestura wheat should be sold to the Spanish, who would send the money to the people of Casali. "The Spaniards are gentlemen, my son," Pozzo said, "and it's a pleasure to fight against such people. Luckily we are no longer living back in the times when Charlemagne fought the Moors, who, when they were at war, it was all killing here, there, and yonder. These new wars are between Christians, thank God. Now that they have their hands full at Rossignano, we'll pass behind them, slip between Rossignano and Pentestura, and we'll be at Casali in 3 days." Having spoken these words at the end of April, Pozzo with his men arrived in sight of Casali on the 24th of May. It was, at least in Roberto's recollection, a fine journey, as they always abandoned roads and trails to cut across the fields. "Makes no difference," Pozzo said, "in wartime everything goes to hell anyway, and if we don't ruin the crops, the others will." In their concern to survive they had a high old time in vineyards, orchards, and chicken runs. "Why not?" Pozzo said, "this was Monferrato land and it should nourish its defenders." When a Mombello peasant objected, Pozzo had the men give him 30 lashes, saying that if you don't maintain a bit of discipline, it's the other side that wins the war. Roberto began to see war as a splendid experience. From wayfarers he heard edifying tales, like the one about the French knight wounded and captured at San Giorgio, who complained that he had been robbed by a soldier of a portrait that was very dear to him, and the Duke of Lerma, on hearing this, had the portrait returned to him, treated his wounds, then gave him a horse and sent him back to Casali. Yet, despite spiraling deviations that made them lose all sense of direction, old Pozzo had seen to it that his band did no real fighting. Thus it was with great relief, but also with the impatience of those who want to participate in a long-awaited festivity, that one fine day, from the top of a hill, they saw the city below their feet and before their eyes, guarded to the north at their left by the broad stripe of the Po, which just in front of the fortress was divided by 2 great islands in the midst of the river, which curved sharply towards the south at the great star-shaped bulk of the citadel. Merry with towers and campaniles inside, Casali seemed impregnable on the outside, all bristling as it was with saw-toothed bastions, which made it resemble one of those dragons you see in storybooks. It was a grand sight. All around the city, soldiers in varicolored garb dragged obsidianal machines among groups of tents bedecked with banners and among knights wearing many-plumed hats. Now and then you could see, against the green of the woods or the yellow of the fields, a sudden flash that wounded the eye, and it was a gentleman's silver cuirass joking with the sun, nor could you guess in which direction he was going. Perhaps he was cantering along just for show. Beautiful for everyone else, the spectacle seemed less happy to Pozzo, who said, "Men, this time we're truly buggered." And to Roberto, who asked why, he added with a slap on the nape, "Don't play stupid, those are Imperials. You surely don't believe there are that many Cassalici or that any of them would come outside their walls for the fun of it. The Cassalici and the French are inside, piling up bales of straw, and fouling their pants because there aren't even 2,000 of them, whereas those men down there must number at least 100,000. Look over at those hills opposite us, too. He was exaggerating. Spinola's army counted only 18,000 foot and 6,000 cavalry, but that was enough, more than enough. What will we do, father? Roberto asked. What we'll do, his father replied, is be careful to see where the Lutherans are, and bear in mind there's no getting past them. In primis, we can't understand one thing they say. In secundus, they kill you first and ask who you are afterwards. Look sharp and discover where the Spaniards are. As I've told you, they're people you can reason with. Make sure they're Spaniards of good family. What counts in these matters is breeding. They picked their way along an encampment identified by banners of their most Catholic majesties, where more cuirasses glittered than elsewhere, and they moved downhill, commending their souls to God. In the confusion they were able to proceed a long way into the enemy's midst, for in those days only select corps, like the musketeers, had uniforms, and with the rest you could never tell who was on your side. But at a certain point, and just when they had only to cross a stretch of no man's land, they encountered an outpost and were stopped by an officer, who urbanely asked who they were and where they were going, while behind him, a squad of soldiers stood, alert. Sir, Pozo said, be so kind as to make way for us, for we must go and take up our proper position in order to fire on you. The officer doffed his hat, bowed with a salute that would have swept dust 2 meters before him, and said, Señor, no es menor gloria venir al enemigo con la cortija en la paz que con las armas en la guerra. Then, in good Italian, he added, proceed, sir. If a fourth of our men prove to have one half of your courage, we will win. May heaven grant me the pleasure of meeting you on the field of battle, and the honor of killing you. Fisti orb don fisti sec, muttered Pozo, using an expression in the language of his lands that is even today an optative, wishing, more or less, that the interlocutor be first blinded and immediately afterwards seized with fatal choking. But aloud, calling on all his linguistic resources and his knowledge of rhetoric, he said, Yo también. He also doffed his hat, spurred his mount gently, not as much as the theatricality of the moment demanded, for he had to allow his men time to follow him on foot as he rode on towards the walls. Say what you like, they're polite people, Pozo said to his son, and it was well that he turned his head, for thus he avoided the shot of an arquebus from the bastions. Ne tiras pas, conditions. On est de amis. Nevers, nevers, he cried, raising his hands. Then he addressed Roberto again. You see what ungrateful people these are. Better the Spaniards, if you ask me. They entered the city. Someone must have promptly reported their arrival to the commander of the garrison, Monsieur de Torres, one-time comrade in arms of old Pozo. Hearty embraces preceded a first stroll along the ramparts. My dear friend, Torres was saying, according to the rolls in Paris I am commanding 5 regiments of infantry of 10 companies each, a total of 10,000 foot soldiers. But Monsieur de Lagrange has only 500 men, Monchat has 250, and in all I can count on 1,700 men on foot. Then I have 6 companies of light cavalry, a total of only 400 men, however well equipped they may be. The cardinal knows I have fewer men than I should, but he insists I have 3,800. I write him, sending proof to the contrary, and his eminence pretends not to understand. I have had to recruit a regiment of Italians as best I could. Corsicans and Monferrini, but, forgive me for saying so, they're poor soldiers. Imagine, I had to order the officers to assign their valets to a separate company. Your men will join the Italian regiment, under Captain Bassiani, a good man. We'll send young Legrive there too, so when he comes under fire he will understand the orders. As for you, dear friend, you will join a group of excellent gentlemen who have come to us of their own free will, as you have, and are in my suite. You know the country and can give me good advice. Jean de Saint Bonnet, Lord of Torres, was tall, dark, with blue eyes, in the full maturity of his 45 years, choleric but generous and naturally conciliatory, brusque in manner but generally affable, also with his soldiers. He had distinguished himself as defender of the Lie de Ré in the war against the English, but apparently he was not liked by Richelieu and the court. His friends repeated in whispers a dialogue between him and the Chancellor de Marillac, who had contemptuously said that in France 2,000 gentlemen could have been found equally capable of handling the Lie de Ré matter as well as Torres, and Torres had replied that 4,000 could be found capable of keeping the seals better than Marillac. His officers attributed a second bon mot to him, though others gave the credit for it to a Scottish captain, in a war council at La Rochelle. The future Grey Eminence Per Joseph, who prided himself on a knowledge of strategy, had put his finger on a map, saying, "We will cross here," and Torres had rebutted coldly, "Unfortunately, Reverend Father, your finger is not a bridge." "This is the situation, cher ami," Torres was saying, pointing to the landscape as they walked along the bastion. "The theater is splendid, and the actors are the best of 2 empires and many seigneuries. Among our adversaries we have even a Florentine regiment, commanded by a Medici. We count on Casale as a city. The castle, from which we control the side towards the river, is a fine fort, defended by a good moat, and at the walls we have made a fine gun platform that will allow the defenders to work well. The citadel has 60 cannon and solidly built bastions. There are some weak points, but I have reinforced them with demilunes and batteries. All this is excellent for withstanding a frontal assault, but Spinola is no novice. Look at those men at work down there, they are preparing tunnels for mines, and when they arrive here below, at the wall, it will be as if we had opened the gates to them. To stop their work we would have to confront them in the open field, but there we are weaker. And as soon as the enemy has brought those cannons closer, he will start bombarding the city, and here the mood of the Kausali civilians becomes important, and I don't trust them very far. For that matter I can understand them. The safety of their city means more to them than does M. de Nevers, and they are not yet convinced that dying for the lilies of France is a good thing. They must be made to understand that with Savoy or with the Spanish they would lose their freedom and Kausali would no longer be a capital but simply another ordinary fortress, like Susa, which Savoy is ready to sell for a handful of gold pieces. In any case we will improvise. After all, this is an Italian comedy. Yesterday I went out with 400 men towards Frassinetto, where the Imperials are concentrating, and they retreated. But while I was engaged down there, some Neapolitans encamped on that hill, in precisely the opposite direction. I had them battered by the artillery for a few hours and I believe there was a fine slaughter, but they haven't cleared out. So who won the day? I swear by our Lord I don't know, and neither does Spinola. But I know what we'll do tomorrow. You see those hovels in the plain? If they were ours, we would have many enemy positions within range. A spy tells me they're empty, and this report gives me good reason to fear that men are hiding there. My dear young Lord Roberto, don't look so outraged. Learn this prime rule. A good commander wins a battle by using informers well, and this second rule. An informer, since he is a traitor, is prompt to betray those who pay him to betray. In any case, tomorrow our infantry will go and occupy those houses. Rather than keep the troops inside the walls to rot, better to expose them to fire, which is good training. Don't be impatient, Lord Roberto, it is not yet your turn. But the day after tomorrow, Bassiani's regiment must cross the Po. You see those walls over there? They are part of a little outwork the local men began before the enemy arrived. My officers don't agree, but I believe it is best to occupy it before the Imperials do. We must keep them within range on the plain, in order to harass them and impede the construction of the tunnels. In short, there will be glory for all. Now let us go to supper. The siege has only begun and provisions are still plentiful. It will be a while before we start eating the rats. Chapter 3. The Seraglio of Wonders. To survive the siege of Kausali, where, as it turned out, he had not been reduced to eating rats, only to arrive on the Daphne, where perhaps the rats would eat him. Timorously meditating on this nice contrast, Roberto was finally prepared to explore those places from which, the evening before, he had heard vague noises. He decided to descend from the quarterdeck and, if all proved to be as it had been on the Amaryllis, he knew he would find a dozen cannons on the two sides, and the pallets or hammocks of the crew. From the helmsman's room he reached the space below, divided by the tiller, which shifted with a slow creaking, and he should have been able to leave immediately by the door that opened into the lower deck. But, as if to gain familiarity with those deeper areas before facing his unknown enemy, he lowered himself further, through a trapdoor, into a space where on another ship there would have been more stores. Instead, he found a room organized with great economy, piluses for a dozen men. So the larger part of the crew slept down here, as if the rest of the space had been reserved for other functions. The pallets were all in perfect order. If there had been an epidemic, when the first men died, the survivors would surely have tidied up systematically. But, come to think of it, who could say whether all the sailors had died, or even any of them? And once again that thought failed to reassure him. A plague killing an entire crew is a natural event, sometimes providential, according to certain theologians. But an event that causes the crew to flee, leaving the ship in this state of unnatural order, might be far more worrisome. Perhaps the explanation was to be found on the lower deck. He had to muster his courage. Roberto climbed back up and opened the door leading to the feared place. He learned now the purpose of those vast gratings that perforated the main deck. Thanks to them, this lower deck had been transformed into a kind of nave, illuminated through the hatches by the full daylight that fell obliquely, intersecting the light that came from the gun ports, colored by the reflection, now ambered, of the cannons. At first Roberto perceived only shafts of sunlight, in which infinite corpuscles could be observed swirling, and as he saw them, he could not help but recall, and how he indulges himself with this play of learned memories, to dazzle his lady, rather than confine himself to bald narration. The words with which the canon of Digne invited him to observe the cascades of light that spread through the darkness of a cathedral, stirring within themselves a multitude of monads, seeds, indissoluble natures, drops of incense that exploded spontaneously, primordial atoms engaged in combat, battles, skirmishes by squadrons, amid numberless conjunctions and separations. Obvious proof of the composition of this universe of ours, made of nothing but prime bodies teeming in the void. Immediately thereafter, as if to confirm the fact that all creation is the work only of that dance of atoms, he had the impression of being in a garden, and he realized that from the moment he entered this place, he had been assailed by a host of odors, far stronger than those that had come to him earlier, from the shore. A garden, an indoor orchard, is what the men from the Daphne had created in this space, to carry home flowers and plants from the islands they were exploring. The gratings allowed the sun, the winds, and the rains to keep the vegetation alive. Whether the vessel would have been able to preserve its sylvan booty through months of voyaging, or whether the first storm would have poisoned all with salt, Roberto could not say, but surely the mere fact that these plants were still alive indicated that the store, like the food, had been only recently collected. Flowers, shrubs, saplings had been brought here with their roots and earth, and set in baskets and makeshift cases. But many of the containers had rotted. The earth had spilled out to create, from one container to the next, a layer of damp humus, where the shoots of some plants were already taking root. It was like being in an Eden sprouting from the very planks of the Daphne. The light was not so strong as to trouble Roberto's eyes, but strong enough to heighten the colors of the foliage and make the first flowers open. Roberto's gaze rested on two leaves that had at first seemed like the tail of a crayfish, from which white jujubes blossomed, then on another pale green leaf where a sort of half-flower was emerging from a clump of ivory lilies. A disgusting stench drew him to a yellow ear into which a little corncob seemed to have been thrust, while near it hung festoons of porcelain shells, snowy, pink-tipped, and from another bunch hung some trumpets or upturned bells with a faint odor of borage. He saw a lemon-colored flower which, as the days passed, would reveal to him its mutability, for it would turn apricot in the afternoon and a deep red at sunset, as others, saffron in the center, faded then to lilial white. He discovered some rough fruits that he would not have dared touch if one of them, falling to the ground and splitting open in its ripeness, had not revealed a garnet interior. He ventured to taste others, and judged them more with the tongue that speaks than with the tongue that tastes, since he defines one as a bag of honey, manna congealed in the fertility of its stem, an emerald jewel brimming with tiny rubies. Now, reading between the lines, I would venture to suggest he had discovered something very like a fig. None of those flowers or those fruits was known to him. Each seemed generated by the fancy of a painter who had wanted to violate the laws of nature and invent convincing absurdities, riven delights and sabid falsehoods. Such as that corolla covered with a whitish fuzz that blossomed into a tuft of violet feathers, but no, it was a faded primrose that extruded an obscene appendage, or a mask that covered a hoary visage with goats' beards. Who could have conceived this bush, its leaves dark green on one side, with wild red-yellow decorations, and the other side flaming, surrounded by other leaves of the most tender pea green, of meaty consistency, conch-shaped to hold the water of the latest rain? Overwhelmed by the spell of the place, Roberto did not reflect on the residue of rain that the leaves were holding, though it surely had not rained for at least 3 days. The perfumes that stunned him led him to consider any enchantment natural. It seemed to him natural that a flaccid, drooping fruit should smell like a fermented cheese, and that a sort of purplish pomegranate with a hole at the bottom, when shaken, should give off a faint rattle as a seed danced about inside it, as if this were not a flower at all but a child's toy. Nor was he amazed by a cusp-shaped blossom, hard and round at the base. Roberto had never seen a weeping palm, like a willow, but he had one before him, its multiple roots forming a paw from which rose a trunk that ended in a single clump, while the fronds of that plaintive plant sagged, exhausted by their own floridness. He had not yet reached another bush that produced broad and pulpy leaves, stiffened by a central nerve that seemed of iron, ready to be used as dishes or trays, while nearby grew other leaves in the form of limp spoons. Uncertain if he was wandering in a mechanical forest or in an earthly paradise hidden in the bowels of the earth, Roberto roamed in that Eden that provoked odorous deliriums. Later, when he tells all this to the lady, he speaks of rustic frenzies, gardens of caprice, protean bowers, cedars, mad with lovely fury. Or else he re-experiences it as a floating cavern rich in deceitful automata where, girded with horribly twisted cables, fanatic nasturtiums billow, wicked stolons of barbarous forest. He will write of the opium of the senses, a whirl of putrid elements that, precipitating into impure extracts, led him to the antipodes of reason. At first he attributed to the song reaching him from the island the impression of feathered voices audible among the flowers and plants. But suddenly his flesh crawled at the passage of a bat that grazed his face, and immediately afterwards he had to duck to avoid a falcon that flung itself on its prey, felling it with a blow of its beak. Moving farther into the lower deck, still hearing the distant birds of the island, and convinced he was hearing them through the openings of the hull, Roberto now realized those sounds were much closer. They could not come from shore. So other birds, and not far away, were singing, beyond the plants, towards the prow, in the direction of that storeroom from which he had heard noises the night before. It seemed to him, as he proceeded, that the garden ended at the foot of a tall trunk that went through the upper deck. Then he realized that he had arrived more or less at the center of the ship, where the mainmast rose from the very bottom of the keel. But by now artifice and nature were so confused that we can justify also our hero's confusion. For, at that very point, his nostrils began to perceive a mixture of aromas, earthy molds, and animal stench, as if he were moving slowly from a flower garden to a sheepfold. He was passing the trunk of the mainmast, heading for the prow, when he saw the aviary. He could think of no other definition for that collection of wicker cages with solid boughs run through them to serve as perch, inhabited by flying creatures striving to discern that dawn of which they had only a beggared light, and to reply with distorted voices to the call of their similars singing in freedom on the island. Set on the ground or hanging from the hatch of the deck above, the cages were arranged along this other nave like stalagmites and stalactites, creating another grotto of wonders, where the fluttering animals made their dwellings rock beneath the sun's rays, in a glitter of hues, a flurry of rainbows. If until that day he had never heard birds really sing, neither could Roberto say he had ever seen birds, at least not in such guises, so many that he asked himself if they were in their natural state or if an artist's hand had painted them and decorated them for some pantomime, or to feign an army on parade, each foot soldier and horseman cloaked in his own standard. An embarrassed Adam, he could give no names to these creatures, except the names of birds of his own hemisphere. That one is a heron, he said to himself, that a crane, a quail. But it was like calling a goose a swan. Here prelates with broad cardinals' trains and beaks shaped like alembics spread grass-colored wings, swelling a rosy throat and revealing an azure breast, chanting in almost human sound. Their multiple squads performed in great tourney, venturing assaults on the depressed domes that circumscribed their arena, among dove-gray flashes and red and yellow thrusts, like oriflammes that a squire threw and caught. Grouchy light cavalry, with long nervous legs in a cramped space, neighed indignantly CRA, at times hesitating on one foot and peering around suspiciously, shaking the tufts on their elongated heads. Only in one cage, built to his measure, a great captain in a bluish cloak, his jerkin as vermilion as his eye and a cornflower plume on his helmet, emitted a dove's lament. In a small co-op nearby, 3-foot soldiers remained on the ground, without wings, lil-skipping clumps of muddied wool, mouse muzzles mustached at the root of long curved beaks equipped with nostrils the little monsters used to sniff as they pecked the worms encountered in their path. In a cage that wound like a narrow alley, a small stork with carrot legs, aquamarine breast, black wings, and flushed beak moved hesitantly, followed by its offspring in Indian file and, as its path ended, it croaked with vexation, first stubbornly trying to break what seemed to it a tangle of withs, then stepping back, reversing direction, with its young bewildered, not knowing whether to go forward or backward. Roberto was divided between excitement at his discovery, pity for the prisoners, and the desire to release them and see his cathedral invaded by those heralds of an airy army, to save them from the siege to which the Daphne, besieged in her turn by the others, their similars outside, had constrained them. He imagined they were hungry, and saw that in the cages there were only crumbs of food, and the dishes and bowls that should have contained water were empty. But not far off he found sacks of grain and shreds of dried fish, prepared by those who meant to take this booty to Europe, for a ship does not go into the seas of the opposite south without bringing back to the courts or academies evidence of those worlds. Proceeding further, he found also a pen made